Welcome, everyone, to the Surfing Historian. I'm your host, Jason Old, historian, surfer, and world traveler. This podcast is dedicated to highlighting some of the latest scholarly research in humanities, social sciences, and surf studies. So paddle out with us while we glide through the world of academia. Joining me today from France is my good friend and colleague, Frederique Carey. Frederique is a lecturer and a researcher at the University of Rennes, where she teaches courses in international trade, marketing and management, and surf economics. Her PhD research weaves together Celtic sea folklore and myths, anthropology, surf photography, and film work analysis to offer an ethnographic study of surfing in Ireland. She also offers a mythopoetical interpretation of surf narratives and iconography, and examines the place of surfing and surfers in the Irish cultural and economic landscapes. I'm super stoked to have you on the show, Frederica. But before we get started, I'd like to thank you, as well as our listeners, for being part of this episode of the Surfing Historian.
Okay, thank you, Jason, for having me. It's very nice to have a platform to be able to share some of my work. It's also nice as it's perfect timing. I just put the final dot to the conclusion of my dissertation last night, so it's kind of still very fresh. And also, as I was telling you earlier, like I'm still just about to come out of the rabbit hole, so I hope I'm going to be able to make sense, because it's still a bit trotting in my head at the moment. So yeah, I basically look at stories. It's always been an interest of mine anyway. I've studied literature and history, so I'm into stories, and I look at stories and I look at surfing stories. And there's a little story of how I got into this whole project. So they basically started 4 years ago. I went to Ireland on a surf trip. That was my first surf trip on my own. And I hadn't been surfing for a long time back then. Actually, I took up surfing rather late in life. And I was looking for somewhere to go to just chill out a little bit. And instead of like thinking, oh, Indonesia or Portugal closer, I decided to go back to Ireland because, well, I had been living in Ireland for a few years. I had lived in Ireland for a few years and then went back to France. And then I was kind of missing it. And I was like, well, it's surfing. It's a good way of getting back in touch with it, so, and also, haven't really heard about Ireland being a surfing nation, but it's an island, there's bound to be some waves somewhere. So I just took my chances, and I went to Bundoran in Donegal, up north, the west coast. And on the first morning I was there, I don't know, there was just something in the water that was I was just like, it's a nice beach. It's a very famous beach in Bundoran. It's outside of the town called Talon Strand. It's nice little waves. I'm not a big wave surfer, so I was happy with the size. Summer waves as well, so it was pretty small. But it was very nice energy. The locals were really nice. The waves were good. There was the sheep in the field. There was the odd ruined castle as well. So sure, there was something different. There's always something different when you travel for surfing, I'm sure. But that time, there was something different. And I started surfing in Brittany as well. I think I should say that. Brittany is in the north of France. It's very similar. It looks very similar to Ireland. The water is cold there as well. So there was lots of similarities. It was still something special. So I was like, hang on, I'm enjoying this. There's nice energy in the water, and there's something a bit kind of special. I want to try and understand what it is. Is there a way I can do a little bit of a research into this? And I was looking for a PhD research subject anyway. I was kind of toying with the idea. And so, yeah, can I maybe try and do my PhD on that? And effectively not surf for about 4 years, pretty much, because that's what research does to you. So yeah, that's how I got started into it. And then I met some people that week I was there. I met some people that were kind of influential in my decision as well, either in person or through their work. So the first person I met, I didn't meet in person, but I met his work, and I was recommended his work. He's a filmmaker. He's Cornish, not Irish. He's Cornish, but he's been very committed to the Irish, the west coast of Ireland. His name is Mickey Smith, and he made quite a famous now short film called Dark Side of the Lens back in 2010. And it's a 6-minute film, and it's about his experiences as a bodyboarder, a photographer, and a videographer, exploring the rugged coastline of the west coast of Ireland and getting smashed by waves winter after winter. And it's a beautiful film. There's something special about that kind of confirmed my first impression I had in the water that first day, that the film tries to kind of describe a world of experiences that surfing allows using symbols and images and a certain visual language. So I was like, I want to try and understand what that visual language is. Like, how does that work? How does he manage to get that, you know? And the second person I met was my husband. I don't know if he's happy for me to mention him, but I met him also on that trip. So, and he is still a videographer and a photographer, a surfer, putting together little films about what it's like to be a surfer in Ireland. Less famous, of course, but still like pretty well appreciated in the community of Bundoran. And I was like, this is interesting, like this nice energy, this nice group of people like enjoying this activity, surfing together and expressing that through the medium of film and photography and stuff. So let's try and have a look at this.
That's such a cool story, and thanks for sharing that. I think what I find most, I guess you might even say serendipitous about it is that, you decide to take this surf trip, and in the process, you become so inspired that you decide to write your dissertation about it, about the surf culture in Ireland, which, in and of itself is a very interesting topic. And of course, as you mentioned earlier, you met your husband during this time too. So, it's such a cool story. And, I'm really stoked that you shared that with us. But I actually would like for you to talk to us a little bit more about your process. You figured out that you wanted to write about this. And, so how did you sort of get this project off the ground? Would you mind sharing a little bit more about your process with us?
So the first step of my research has been to basically rely on ethnographic methods, observational participation and so on. I also did lots of documentary research, and I gathered a very big corpus of film work, photography, literature, accounts from the press, and I also started doing interviews. And that's how my husband's been influential, because he kind of opened me onto this community. Like, he opened the door for me and introduced me to some of the first people I interviewed. And so with all this, the data I collected, I started to draw a little portrait of the surfing community in Ireland. So that's the first stage, basically describing. And this is where I started to kind of think of how I was going to use all this data. So I basically, in my research, I use 5 theoretical models. So basically 5 sets of theories that I use in order to understand what surfing in Ireland is. So the first model is the one I'm going to explain now. But that stage, when I finished the field work, I had read quite a bit of surf research work, and I had come across the work of a French PhD candidate. Her name is Anne Bargelin-Smith, and maybe it's somebody who you would like to interview. She's done her PhD dissertation on surfing in Florida, and she relies on theories of social linguistics to examine surfing. In her dissertation, she looks at the surfing culture in Florida as a Creole language, basically a cultural hybrid. You know what a Creole is, obviously it's a mother tongue that is formed from the contact of the European language like French or English, and in contact with local languages like African languages spoken by the slaves in the West Indies, it develops into a language of its own. And so it's both similar to the original language, but it also has very distinctive features. So like Anne Bargelin-Smith has done with surfing in Florida, I'm using that theory. I'm transferring a theory that applies to languages, to a cultural phenomenon, which is surfing. And so I consider surfing in Ireland as a Creole, as a cultural hybrid developed from a mother tongue. And so the mother tongue here is it's basically the practice of surfing as historically it first developed in Hawaii and then California and so on. And it's also the global surfing art practice as it is portrayed in the mainstream media. Like for the non-surfer, the first images that come to mind is that global the images from the global practice of surfing, which is people in board shorts and so on. And so I consider surfing in Ireland as some sort of a dialectal variation of that language with its own specificities, basically. So it's surfing, the global surfing culture versus localized practice of surfing. And so as a Creole, as a hybrid language, surfing in Ireland shares similarities with the global practice and has distinctive features. And so I've isolated basically two main striking features that are very specific to Ireland and surfing in Ireland. So the first one is the one that, obviously, that's the one that immediately comes to your mind when you think of surfing in Ireland. Like, you don't even have to go to Ireland to think of it. It's the geographic singularities of the environment in which surfing is done there, and it's the climate. Ireland is an island. It's exposed to the North Atlantic. It's fully exposed to the swell, to the winds. It boasts some of the best big wave surfing in Europe. No, quite obviously, you find them on the west coast of Ireland. Some of the most famous waves, I don't know if you know about the waves in Ireland, some of the most famous big wave spots are Mullaghmore, Riley's, Aileen's. They're not a secret anymore, so I don't feel shy about mentioning them. They mostly break in the winter as well, so that's the wave season. So those waves have helped to put Ireland on the surfing map now, and they attract surfers from all over the world. But so Ireland also presents some traits that make surfing very, very quite different and quite challenging as well, because winter is the wave season. Obviously, climate comes into play, and the cold in the winter can be quite harrowing, and surfing can make for a rough and humbling experience. And it does impact the surfers' bodies, their minds, the communities in a number of ways that are quite interesting to observe throughout the surfing narratives, the surfing stories are collected. Apart from the cold, which you can get used to, especially if you have the right gear and the right mindset, I'd say as well. You also have the winds. The winds are something it's special in Ireland, that constantly changing. A surfer I interviewed said, you are constantly battling the winds in Ireland. They can make a perfect session, or they can destroy a perfect swell entirely. The light is another one. Especially up in Donegal in the north, where you only get a few hours of daylight in the winter. And so the probability that tides and swell and winds are going to tie in makes it a little bit more of a challenge. Another surfer in Bundoran told me, like Aaron is his name, he said, in the winter, I've often sat there in the dark in the afternoon after 5, wondering how many waves are not being surfed, And so already those characteristics, they already make for interesting stories to read and to listen to. Talking about stories, that's for me the second distinctive trait of Irish surfing, and we're still in the first model here that I'm using. The second characteristics of Irish surfing that makes Irish surfing different, I think, is the expressions of surfing in Ireland. In my dissertation, I contend that those expressions, the stories, and by stories I mean the oral narratives from the interviews I collected, the films also, the photographs, the illustrations, the paintings, all of that. This is a text I consider. And those expressions, they are what makes Irish surfing very special. Yeah, and you find those singularities in the text, but it also in the orality of some of the text. When it's an interview, for example, there's a certain way of and tone of saying things, and also in the visual elements that I was mentioning earlier, some symbols and the Irish. I know it's a bit of a cliche, but they're good storytellers, and I'm looking at that. They're very good storytellers. They have a knack for storytelling. They have a certain humor. They have a certain wit. And they like to draw on symbols as well, on images that can be very telling, or they like to add a bit of drama as well onto the things that happen to them. They either create drama, or they like to add drama in the way they talk about those events. There's this Irish stand-up comedian I was watching the other day. His name is Dylan Moran. He says, the thing about us Irish, we like to add drama in every aspect of our daily life. So the Irish person, they get up in the morning, they check out the window, they look for the weather, like they want to see what's the weather going to be like. And they're like, oh my God, it's fierce mild. And that's the Irish for you. It's about, being a bit dramatic, and gives you a little bit of a kick.
From what I've gathered with your research, it's essentially an ethnography of Irish surfers. And again, correct me if I'm wrong, but based on what I was reading, you combine surfing and Irish folklore to tell a story that really weaves together the ocean, surfing, and folklore, something that you refer to as surflore. And I hope I'm pronouncing that right. But I guess, before you continue on with, the different theories and frameworks you've used, which I find extremely interesting, some of which I can use in my research. But is that a good way to summarize your research? And, as you move through some of these theories, could you elaborate a little bit on that term itself, surflore? Like, what does that mean? And how does that apply to your research?
So surfing is a cultural practice, right? It's a sport for some, it's a hobby for others. It's also a way of life for a lot of people I interviewed. So it's a cultural practice in the sense that it differentiates the people who do it from others, motorbikers and skateboarders and whatever. So they form a group with a distinctive culture, and so that culture expresses itself through text, through photos, through films, through stories and behaviors and beliefs and so on. And that's what a folklore is. So a culture is basically a way of doing things. I think it's a handy definition and perhaps a bit simplistic, but that's what a culture is. It's how we do things around here. That's a culture. A folklore is the expression of that way of doing things. A culture is a way of life. A folklore is how that way of life expresses itself in the arts, in social usages and customs. And so the narratives are collected, again, the interviews, the film work, the photographs, etc. They are a folklore. They are a way of expressing the culture of the surfing community in Ireland. There's a famous folklorist, American folklorist called Alan Duns, who said folklore is a mirror of culture. It expresses it, it reflects it. And so when you study a folklore, you have an entry in the culture it expresses. And that's why I'm referring to the material I study as a surflore and not as a surf culture, because I'm actually studying the Irish surf culture through the surflore, basically. And so the stories are collected, again, text, images, and so on. They share knowledge and learning held in common by the Irish surfers. And so they fit the many definitions that are given of a folklore. For example, it's a body of knowledge learned by word of mouth, participation, demonstration. And so by considering the material I've gathered as a surflore, then I can use the tools of folkloristics, of the study of folklore, to collect, classify, and start interpreting this material. I call it a surflore because folklore, the etymology, is basically the lore, the culture of the common people, the folk. And so obviously here I look at the lore of the surfing people, basically, and the surfing practice. So that's how I coined the term surflore. And it's a modern folklore. And it's that was the idea as well. I wanted to clean up the image of folklore, which is in a lot of people's minds. It's about old wives' tales and so on. And it's there was two things I wanted to kind of clean up the image of, basically, in my dissertation. Surfing as being something serious. It doesn't have to be a crazy, lazy sort of subject. A lot of people think I took up surfing as a PhD dissertation just to surf more, while actually I haven't surfed that much. And I kind of curse myself sometimes for choosing it. And the second thing I wanted to dust off a bit is the idea that folklore is a relic from the past. There's modern folklores everywhere because they are expressions of modern cultures everywhere and popular cultures everywhere. And there are so many modern folklores that you can look at in the way I looked at the Irish surfing culture. Any group who has a shared practice, passion, and knowledge, skateboarders, you have skate lore, video gamers, competitive horse riders, motorbikers, anybody, like good dog owners, there's a dog owner lore, because people will, like, you tell a joke about your dog to somebody who doesn't have a dog, they're not going to get it that well. Buskers, selfie addicts, people with tattoos, even, now that I think of it, PhD candidate. We probably don't share the same passion. We've been through the same experience. There's probably a PhD dissertation lore there. Like, there you go. It's probably another subject for you. So yeah, basically that's the second framework I've been using to examine surfing in Ireland. That's the Surfloric Model. And it's, I think, interesting to see how you can use it for other cultural expressions as well. And the reason it's interesting for me at this stage in my research, after I've described the surfing community through ethnography, is that it's allowed me to borrow from the tools of folkloristics to organize all my data, because I had enormous amount of data from the fieldwork. I only had 30 odd interviews, but they were very long because I'm not one for keeping things short. For one, and also because we had loads of footage, and also there was loads of documentary research. So I organized all my stories, including illustrations and paintings and film work. I consider them as stories, and I classify them into the Surfloric Index. That's the name of it. My Surfloric Index classifies and numbers the recurrent themes of the Irish surfing narratives that I have. There's 4 general types of narratives in my classification. Type 1 is basically historical tales. They gather the narratives that I have that root the development of surfing in Ireland. So it's a historical approach, and also it's a very contemporary, like, societal approach. It raises all the issues related to surfing as it's being developed now in Ireland, the current issues, the environmental issues, and also the perspective for development. So that's the historical approach. The type 2 is personal experience narratives. So this is more like personal stories of the surfers I interviews, and the surfers are on the foreground here. They talk about their experiences of surfing, basically, and how they relate to it. Type 3 places the waves on the foreground. So this is called Tales of Waves. And it's basically stories about waves, how they were discovered, how such and such waves was discovered, how they were named. There's always a very good story behind the name of a wave, like whether it's just a sign that happened to be there. There's the wave Pampa in Bundoran, is named after a sign for an insurance company that was just there. And there's the name Aileen's at the foot of the cliffs of Moher. There's a mythological name that I can tell you the story later if you like. So that's the type 3, is about waves as the hero in the stories. And then the last type is Surf Island, basically tales of the elements. So these are narratives that really deal with the environmental singularities of surfing in Ireland that we mentioned earlier. So the light, the cold, the wind, and so on, the climate.
Before I move on to some more questions specific to your research, I know that, I remember seeing, thinking about some surf videos, not that long ago, and I was, I saw people surfing in Ireland. I was like, wow, okay. I never thought about that. And beyond that, the waves were huge. And so I was like, wow, this is a big wave spot, essentially. But I guess my question, just sort of a quick question, is when did surfing really start in Ireland?
So I know when it first started anyway, it started like there's a little kind of a mythical story behind the story of how surfing started in Ireland. And there's the story of Joe Roddy is the first one that is allegedly is the first person who built his own board and started to ride waves, and that was back in the end of the 1940s, like close to 1950. But he didn't really go down into legend. He stayed very local, and it's only after that we started learning about him. One of the forefathers of Irish surfing, the person who is called the grandfather of Irish surfing, is a man called Cavey on the east coast of Ireland. And early in the 1960s, he saw a picture. He was reading a Reader's Digest, and he saw a picture of a man riding waves in, I forget, Hawaii or somewhere like that. And he realized that, well, the size of the waves they're not so different from the waves I can see from my window there. So he started just kind of thinking about it. And then same story, he started building his own board, had some experiments building his own board and trying to surf basically. And he got so mad about it, he started to try to convert more people into it, toured Ireland a couple of times, that did the first surf ferries. And then he I think he contacted, or he got in touch with the San Diego club, or he was invited to participate to a championship to represent Irish surfers, because in over in America they were like, this is a man, like this is Irish dude is like, what, we don't know what he's doing, but let's have him over. Like, so he went and he had the opportunity to go to California, and then he went to Hawaii, met the Duke, and it was like, he was all this, you know, kind of 20, 30-year-old kid just like dreaming that and living the dream and bringing back to Ireland this dream and trying to convert more people. The first clubs were formed, the ISA was formed, the Irish Surfing Association. So in terms of how it appeared in the press, I don't think there was really a mainstream documentation of it, although he did try to communicate about it, but it's more like local competitions and so on grew from there. The momentum really, I think, was reached in the, well, really in the 1990s, when the first big wave spots were discovered, like prowlers and so on, and the, you know, the advent of toe surfing, and then Mickey Smith, that I was mentioning at the beginning, played a huge part in that, because he, for about 4 or 5 years, in the early 2000s, he roamed literally the west coast of Ireland. He was like determined to like explore every nooks of it, and he discovered the waves of Riley's, for example, was discovered by him, this bodyboarder. Him and friends of his, like actually most of the like famous waves or in Ireland have been discovered by these groups of bodyboarders. It goes to show that there shouldn't be any cleavage between like bodyboarders and surfers, you know, they're all part of the same group. Like, and so yeah, Riley's and Bumbleoids, and like he discovered those waves, and he made those he took some of the photographs that were published in Carve magazine, went around the world, and boom, there you were. Like there was already people mad to come and see those waves. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so there really is a legacy or long history of, you know, surfing in Ireland. It's not just the 90s where it just all of a sudden appeared. You know, like you said, you have individuals from Ireland that had traveled to Hawaii, that had traveled to California, and you know, it didn't become recognized until people started to, you know, like you say, the media started to promote some of these big wave spots. And, you know, as far as, so I do want to bring you back to, you know, some of this surfing tradition and the surf lore that you talk about. And, you know, you talk about in your research, well, your research in and of itself, you say it offers an ethnographic study of surfing in Ireland, as well as a mythopoetical interpretation of surf narratives and iconography, and a market-oriented examination of the place of surfing in the Irish cultural and economic landscapes. I guess, you know, my question about that is what does that all mean? And, you know, sort of, it seems tied into that as far as surf lore and, you know, the sort of the fusion of culture with Irish history is, at least it was pretty prominent in some of the things you were talking about or presented as this Finn McCool character. And so can you talk a little bit about that character as well? And does that tie into this mythopoetical interpretation as well? Hopefully I'm understanding your research in the way you were hoping to present it. And so am I making sense with that?
Yeah. I can explain the character of Finn McCool. Maybe not straight away. I think I need to bring a bit of context to that, because it's really kind of on the periphery of all of it. It's kind of it's more an example I use, and one of the examples of I use of the elements of myth. You mentioned the mythopoetical model, so I think I should start with that to explain, because at the moment we're at the stage of my research. We've described what the Irish surfing community is like. And we've gathered it's a folklore, so we have an entry into that culture to try and understand it. So there you go. I implemented this Surfloric index that I designed, and when I started looking at it, this is when I realized that the elements of symbols I was mentioning earlier, related to the dark side of the lens, that film, all the kind of elements of myth and the sacred, like you have this impression of a transcendence coming from this little film. Those elements of myth, they're quite prominent, and they appear like the whole section of the heroes, the surfer's journey in the index is there's loads of references, much more than all the other themes. Loads of symbols related to the figure of the monster and the hero. It started, I think, when, well, anecdotally, it started with my then boyfriend Giles. He was saying, big wave surfing, because he's into big wave surfing. It's like slaying the dragon, and it kind of got me. I know I have a bit of a thing for, mythical stories and legends, so I kind of jump onto that, obviously. But it was then brought up in another interview. I interviewed Ollie O'Flaherty, a well-known big wave surfer from County Clare, and he was comparing the wave of Mullaghmore to a bull. The bull is such a prominent figure in mythology, like it's the mythical creature. It's the beast. It's very ambivalent as well. And he said, Mullaghmore is the bull. Aileen's is more like this smooth, graceful kind of creature from Avatar. So there you go. We were in the myth, like we were on that level. Also, lots of references to the surfer being the hero, like the heroic, but the heroification, if I could say, of the hero of the surfer, which isn't really surprising when you think of it, because as far as surfing is concerned, it's an individual sport. It's quite competitive. It's about challenging the elements. So the heroic narrative is obviously very present, and you find it in most surfing communities. So here it's about looking at the Irish version of the hero surfer, and in the Irish narratives it takes on a distinctive color, and that's what I look at, and that's where I use a third set of concepts, which is the mythopoetics. So it's basically a method to read and to interpret those elements of myths in the surflore that I gathered. Given the number of references to the surfer as the hero, the waves as the monster, and so on, I organized one of the category in my index to gather those references, and this is why it's called the surfer's journey, as a reference to Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, and it follows some of the steps of the hero's journey. So I'm sure you're familiar with the hero's journey theory. Maybe I can just sum it up very quickly. Joseph Campbell was a mythologist. He studied a wide variety of mythological tales from all over the world, and he figured that all were based on a single scenario, which he called the monomyth. And it's basically the common, a common template for stories that involve a hero who goes on an adventure, goes through various ordeals, is victorious in a decisive crisis, and comes home transformed. And Joseph Campbell's monomyth is made of 17 steps. So they may or may not all appear in the narratives, but essentially the main steps are all present. And you find them in surfing interviews, but you find them in Star Wars, you find them in most stories that we read or watch. And the three main stages actually are always there. The first one is departure, and the second one is initiation. The third one is return. And so these you find all across the surfloric material that I have. Departure is the call to adventure, the supernatural aid. Initiation is about the road of trials. It's going through stages like, trials and errors, meeting the abyss, the ultimate boon, the symbolic death of the hero and his resurrection. And the third stage is the return. And this is where you have the stage of the return threshold, and how do you go back to the ordinary world, having this knowledge that you have from the other world, and so on. So the mythopoetical model, I know it's a bit of a mouthful, but it's basically a method for reading the narratives I collected by considering the elements of myth in those stories. I look at how a myth emerges in some of the text. So I obviously chose the most prominent one. There could be others, but I chose the one of the hero. And then I look at how it emerges. Now I look then at how it can be found in other forms, or in one form or another, in other texts and narratives. So in other pictures, other films, and so on. I also examine the references to other myths. And I also look at how the myth of the hero in the surfing narratives is very flexible, how it evolves, it develops, it reinvents itself constantly throughout the material. And by that, I follow the methods of mythopoetics, which is I borrow from literary criticism, for example. And one of the main proponents of that method is Pierre Brunel in France. And so I consider the reasons also, but why those elements of myths are there, which is why it's called mythopoetics, because the Greek word poet means maker. So a mythopoet is a myth maker. So I consider the filmmakers, the authors, the speakers in my interviews, the painters, and so on. I consider them as creators of myth, because I think that by referring directly or indirectly, consciously or unconsciously to myths, well, they create a new myth. The myth up here, it's the hero, the Irish surfer hero. And I want to understand why they're doing this, basically. I also want to question the creation act of the myth. So this method basically allows me to do two things. The first one is it allows me to read the stories, to identify, describe the elements of myths. And the second thing I can do then is to contextualize those elements of myths, to try and explain basically what they mean, what functions they serve within the Irish community, and also outside of it, because the image of the surfer is being used, it's being borrowed, it's being reappropriated by the surfing industry, but also by businesses, the Irish government, for example, to promote tourism. So there's a lot of interpretations to be done of why this myth is there.
Yeah, I would love to get your thoughts on that, and like you said, as far as like an illustration. And so I just I thought I found that one as combing through your research, your presentations, and that one was just very prominent.
Yeah, so the elements of myth, you find them, for example, in illustration. I think you're referring to you're referring to either two things that I have in mind right now, two images. So there's the comic strip by Barry Britton, who is an artist from Donegal, also one of the grandfathers of Irish surfing, and a very, very good surfer, very respected artist, and he's incorporated a lot of elements of myths in his illustrations. Another one is an illustration by a local artist from Sligo, although I met her in Bandoran. I'm not too sure where she lives now, but her name is Aislinn Gallagher Clark, and I could give you all the references to the art if you wanted to add them as well, because I really like people to actually see those pictures, because it's very difficult to talk about images in a podcast. And she has this painting called Conor Mcguire dropping in on the giant. Conor Mcguire is a local charger from Bandoran, and he's dropping on the giant wave at Mullaghmore, but behind him in the barrel is Finn McCool, who is a giant from the mythological saga from Celtic Ireland. And the giant is understood in both senses. It's the wave, but it's also on the giant Finn McCool, because Conor Mcguire is obviously dropping in on him as well. So here you can see how we tap into the myth, and we also tap into the figure of the hero there. So you find them in illustrations, you find them in the photographs as well, you find them in the personal stories I have collected. And maybe just give an example of, I was talking about the whole hero's journey there. So you find a lot of the different stages of the hero's journey in the narratives I've collected, and in the pictures and so on. And so you can read all those stories, text, films, and so on in the light of the initiation journey. The journey, you probably know that the journey starts with an individual living in the ordinary world. He receives a call to adventure. This will translate as a surfer has taken on surfing, the mentor, the companions he meets along the way, the different battles as well that mark the progress of his surfing life. So this will include various successes, big and small, wipeouts, big and small, or just breaking a leash, twisting an ankle. Your first big barrel is usually a question I ask in my interviews. Can you tell me about your first memorable wave, or your best wave recently? Getting through the learning process of surfing, getting changed in the cold, getting hit in the head by your board, all of this, it's part of the journey and the initiation. And then then comes the final battle. So sometimes also the fall. Something like an apotheosis, like gets the surfer across to another world. It's another world of experience. It's something where he learned something. He learned something about the world, about himself. It changes him. And so when he returns to the ordinary world, he's a different being that can make a difference. So an example of that here is, for example, it's a well-known story of, if you're Irish, it's well-known anyway, of, and if you're Irish and a surfer, it's well-known. Seamus McGoldrick is a bodyboarder from County Clare, a big wave charger. He's sustained a horrendous injury at Riley's. Riley's is a beautiful, infamous wave in County Clare. Now so again, as I said, it's a very talented bodyboarder. He's known for charging the slabs there. And on that day, he broke his femur, and he probably would have lost his life actually if he hadn't been rescued. It was a pretty gnarly experience. And that's the fall of our hero there. He falls on the wave. It's the symbolic death in the sense that, because of course that injury set him back. He couldn't surf for a very long time, and you know what kind of a mindset this can throw you. So when he could surf again sometime later, he actually, by some divine intervention, and that's his words, not mine, by some divine intervention, he was able to go and surf his dream wave pipeline. And then there he met the founder of his sport, bodyboarding. He met Tom Murray and was able to contribute to a fundraising to help Tom Murray out. And so in a way to give back to the man who founded the sport. And he thought there was a bit of a story there. And so that setback, that injury, the going over the falls, meeting the abyss, got him eventually to fulfill his goal as a bodyboarder on pipeline, but also to come to the realization of what his surfing life should be about. Not just chasing waves all over the world and wave after wave, but also to give back. And so now Seamus still surfs, of course, but he's also running a surf school in Strandhill, and he's very committed to it, takes on lots of charity causes as well. And he takes pride on taking a step back from the waves and giving back to the community. He says he enjoys helping other people enjoying the waves, and it's not so much about him taking the wave anymore. So it marks the resurrection, the symbolic rebirth of the hero. He comes back from that world of experience he's been to the ordinary world with a new sort of knowledge and the will to help change it for the better. Now, there's a second example I want to mention as well, because it's quite striking and it can take us to the final two models that I'm using in my research and to tie it in with the market examination and so on that you were mentioning. So another well-known surfer from County Clare is Fergal Smith. He's a big wave charger. He used to be sponsored to travel all over the world and compete and surf the biggest waves. His surfing journey, in a lot of senses, from the call to adventure to deciding to embrace the surfing lifestyle to pursue a career as well as a competing surfer, it follows almost every step of the hero's journey. So I haven't interviewed him yet, but it's something like, it's one, you can find information in the press. He did a TED talk about his the project he has on that I'm going to mention. So all the information you find online. Most of this, you can find almost every single step of the hero's journey in his surfing life. And there's one injury that he had at Cloudbreak, I think, during a competition. It set him back, stopped him from surfing for some time, and during which he had to battle, the frustration, the anger for a few days. That we went really deep in that, the not surfing when there's perfect waves out there kind of thing. And especially because he was all set on pursuing a competitive surfing career there, it kind of threw him over the falls there. And what happened at that time as well was back in 2011, the Fukushima disaster happened. And that sort of joined him in his train of thoughts. And he created something like, what am I doing here? And what am I doing for the world? Kind of thought, which eventually led him to go home, go back to Ireland, stop traveling for waves, and instead he co-founded a community farm called Moorhill Farm in County Clare, and it's a farm that's very community centered. It's all about sustainable modes of production and consumption. The methods are based on regenerative agriculture, conservation and rehabilitation approach to food and farming systems. It's also very locally focused. It has a trade model that stands for fair consumption. It's very focused on the community with volunteer days and so on. So that's a very striking illustration, I think, of the surfer's journey here, because the hero takes on the call to adventure, opposing social conventions as well. Like most of his mates were going to study at university, he decided to embrace that roaming lifestyle. He battles his way throughout the surfing life. He meets ordeals, setbacks, emerges victorious in a number of battles until he meets the object of his quest. And here it's the wave at Cloudbreak that he wanted to surf for so long, but he falls, and that's the symbolic death. He has to fight the ultimate battle. And here the ultimate battle that's, takes place within himself, in his own mind. And he comes out victorious in a way. That's the resurrection. He has a new understanding of what his purpose in this life should be. He comes back to the ordinary world with this knowledge and determination and power to try and transform it. And then that's a whole different journey that begins. If you have a quick look at Fergal Smith's TED talk about the whole project of Mohill community, how it came about and how he went on about it, it was a whole quest in itself, like to get it up and going. And that's what Joseph Campbell implies as well. Like you can embark on as many journeys as you go through life, in your life as an individual or as a surfer, and each journey as a challenge, a setback, rewards, ultimate fights, symbolic deaths, resurrections, and so on. But that, that's what Campbell says. He says, I think a good life is one hero journey after another. There's always the possibility of fiasco, but there's always the possibility for bliss as well. So that's what I look at. And I look at, so I gave you two examples of actual lives of surfers that illustrate the myth, but you find them in the representations of surfing through this comic strip I was mentioning, the illusion of the reference to the giant from mythology who's reincarnated into a surfer. And so, yeah, but really, like, you find it all across the material of Surflore in Ireland. And I think what the hero's journey tells us is that those images, the myth of the hero, really taps into an archaic sort of symbolism, that's universal, speaks to every culture. You find it everywhere. And rituals, like initiation rituals, are common and universal as well. You find them in primitive societies and in the modern experience as well. You can see how when you read and analyze the Surflore as a mythical initiation experience, you can see how the Surflore material kind of expresses a collective imagination where you have images and symbols that are powerful instruments of expressions. And so when you express your experience as a surfer in that way, I think when you borrow from the myth, when you use the myth, you become a mythopoet, a myth maker. You create a mythical story that taps into a universal supply of images that will touch the imagination of other people, whether or not they're surfers, whether or not they can relate to your story and your experience. And this, I think, explains why the surfing imagery and the symbol of the hero surfer is so much used and borrowed and reappropriated by the industry, businesses that are related or not to surfing in their marketing strategy. In Ireland, Ireland is not an exception. Like surfing's popularity is growing. An increasing number of brands are using the values of surfing to promote themselves. You have Guinness ads using it. Even AIB Banking did an ad back in 2008 with a surfer. The Irish government is heavily leaning on also the development of surfing to promote Ireland as a tourism product. Basically, this leads me to, we are reaching the final stage of this dissertation and the research, because we've analyzed the folklore now. We have analyzed the Surflore and we've been like, okay, there's a myth there, and what does it mean, and so on. But what's the purpose of it all, basically? So this is where you need context, and this is where you need to look at Irish society and so on.
Yeah, Frederica, thanks for clarifying and providing some context to that. It's also incredibly fascinating how these stories tie into modern surf culture and are still relevant and significant. So, it just seems that even in the anecdotes you shared about, the quote unquote surfer's journey. And, I find that extremely interesting. And I guess really when we think about it, we all of us surfers have our own, journey of sorts. And of course, ours seems to have taken us down the path of academia. But I appreciate you giving me and the listener the backstory to, that all of that folklore and Irish history, and even the surflore as you call it. And really, because as you said, it's you need to be Irish and need to be a surfer to understand some of the nuance to it. And so like I said, thanks for sharing that with us and giving us those illustrations. Clearly I was a little bit off on my interpretation of the artwork, but that's what I have you on here for. So I also know that you're working on a documentary that weaves together your research, interviews, and all of that into film. And so could you talk about your plans with that, and also just some takeaways that you have for the listeners in terms of your research and what you want us to walk away with understanding. And with that, Frederica, you get the last word.
Thanks. Yeah, indeed. When I started that research with Giles, who works, my husband, who works, he has a film production company called Pockets Full of Water. Giles Carey Videography. That's the two names he goes by at the moment. And we are looking to do a documentary that's based on my research, basically, and on the interviews we've done and on the surfloric material. The idea is that there's basically two objectives. The first one is to give back to the community of Irish surfers who have welcomed us and who have shared so much. So it's the idea of giving back to them as well. And I started doing that with the podcast I'm also running, the Tales from the Green Shores on SoundCloud. That it's kind of similar to what you're doing, but more low key, let's say, and more humble in its ambitions. And the documentary was kind of like the bigger stage, and the next stage. Well, we are still working on it. Life has been catching up with us, pandemic and so on. So we're looking to, at some point, we're going to go into crowdfunding, I think, and apply for funding to try and do it, because we also want to be able to have graphic designers do some animation, because we deal with myth and folklore, and we can't just shoot everything ourselves. We need to have animation to represent some of the stuff we're talking about. It's very difficult to film a dragon. And the idea is to really, I think, show that people surf in Ireland, they're lovely people, and they have their own culture that's really worth exploring and getting to know. They also, and that's another thing I look into my research, they have this cultural expressions that are called surflore, but they have also a certain way of positioning themselves in society, in contemporary Irish society, and to engage with it. And various numbers of great number of initiatives like Mohill Farm, but other charities like Liquid Therapy, related to surfing or not, that basically shows that Irish surfers are committed to contributing to their community, but also to society at large. So it really, I think, is very interesting to look at that through the angle of folklore, because when you set out to understand, to uncover the distinct identity of Irish surfers, their ways of expression of social belonging, when you look at the ways as well that they position themselves within the society at large, and they contribute to it, you can see that storytelling, folklore, and the myth making that happens with it still has a role to play in reinventing traditions from the past and opening a window onto the contemporary world and its issues, and addressing those issues. And I think there's very good learning in how Irish surfers are addressing some of those issues, basically.
If you enjoyed my interview with Frederique Carey, I'd like to invite you to join me next time when I sit down to chat with my good buddy and colleague, Dr. Rob Koch. Rob has a PhD in history from the University of South Florida and is also a combat veteran whose research focuses on the Cold War. For this episode, I'll chat with Rob about his research on Juan Perón, fascism, and the global Cold War. This will certainly be an episode you won't want to miss. This has been another episode of The Surfing Historian. I'm your host, Jason Old. Be sure to share, like, and subscribe to never miss an episode. Again, thanks for listening, and until next time, stay stoked.